Hello, Peter. Thank you for joining me. Good to see you.
Hi Emma, great to be here.
So, let's get to know you a bit then at the start. So, can you talk us through when did you come to Quakers? What were you seeking and what did you find?
Okay, so I discovered Quakers for the first time in 2005, just before I turned 30. Um, I'd kind of always been spiritual. I think I remember even in primary school. I'd been set an essay once by a teacher who liked to challenge us, and the title of the essay she gave us one weekend was God. Nice, straightforward title to give to a 10-year-old to write about, and uh, and I still have somewhere a copy of what I wrote, and it began. Some people think that God's home is the church. I disagree. I think God is everywhere. I am writing this essay with God. So that was kind of, I was always like a free thinker and reach my own conclusions about things. But spirituality wasn't really at the forefront of my life in my teens, in my 20s. Um, at some point, maybe in my mid 20s, I began to read spiritual books, books by people like Wayne Dyer, for example. My mum was a psychotherapist. She was training in the psychosynthesis psychotherapy approach, which is a more spiritual orientation, and had a lot of books at home in the library. So I picked them up and was listening, and a few cassette programs as well that she had back in those days. Um, and that kind of really spoke to me what I was reading. I think one of the first books that had an impact on me was "You'll See It When You Believe It" by Wayne Dyer. Um, and that kind of became more um, uh, intense, more prominent in my life when I got my first home and was living on my own, doing a lot of kind of reading on spiritual topics. Um, and was what was missing, what I kind of lacked was some community to share that spiritual journey with, because it was just a very solitary pursuit, and I was living on my own, and I was kind of wanting to share that journey with others. So I was searching for a community. I signed up for something called an Alpha course that was being run by one of the local churches near to where I lived at the time. That was in Tunbridge Wells. And the course was advertised as a chance to explore some of life's deepest, biggest questions. And that really appealed to me. But what I found is actually the course was, and it was very well run and they were very friendly, but it was more about providing a one size fits all set of answers to those big questions. And at the same time, I was attending briefly one of the local churches. And when I started attending, they happened to be running a series of kind of sermons on social justice issues, make poverty history. I think was quite a big initiative at the time, and that was great, and I attended for a couple of months, but then with the Alpha course and in that church, and more so in another church which I went to, which my mum had been going to at that time, um, there was the emphasis on belief. So, um, kind of what believing the right inverted commas things about God, about Jesus particularly, and it was sometimes often implied, and on occasions explicitly stated that if we didn't believe those right things, then fire and brimstone. And both my heart and my head rebelled against that. That you say God is love. What? How does love send Mahatma Gandhi to hell because he doesn't believe the right things, kind of thing? It didn't make add up. So I mean, there was one occasion when I almost walked out of a church service mid-sermon. I wish now that I had done, but I was with my mum at the time, and she was temporarily part of that community, and I didn't want to kind of, I didn't on that occasion, but um, I was very close to doing so. But I stopped going to the sort of traditional evangelical churches, but I still had that hunger for a spiritual community, a community of other seekers, I guess. And one day, I think I was at work and it was lunchtime, and I was browsing the internet, and I was on the BBC website religion and ethics section. I don't know if there still is a religion and ethics section on BBC website, but this is kind of going back to 2005. And I was exploring different Christian denominations and trying to find something a bit more progressive, I guess. I'd started getting interested in progressive Christianity. People like Marcus Borg, who had a different take on what Christianity is about. And when I came across the page that was talking about Quakers, well, I remember a couple of things they said on that website. One was, I think that for Quakers, what we believe is not so important as what we do with what we believe. So that kind of emphasis on, on the golden rule, I guess at its simplest, on showing up in the world and being kind and looking out for one another. And the other thing was the idea of that of God in everyone. And yeah, as I was kind of reading that I think it was a bullet point list, but I was just thinking, yeah, that's me. That's where I'm at. And that idea of God in everyone really spoke to me. So I went along to my then local Quaker meeting and experienced the worship, and I'm still involved with Quakers. What are we, 20 years down the line from there? I kind of see Quakers as my base camp, if you like, from where I explore other things. So I continue to explore. Have done a lot of reading, but less so in recent years. More the journey now is the inward journey, the meditation, contemplation, that kind of times of stillness where I go in and try and reach to that of God or spirit within me, so that I can I can be grounded in that, and I can live from that, and it can live through me. Um, that's kind of my practice with Quakers. I haven't been recently a frequent attender at my local meeting. I go occasionally. I was reflecting last night, actually, at the end of the month. Um, I do something called the examine, where I look back over my experiences of the previous month, and um, when I kind of felt most closely or closest to God, or you could say most aligned with my true self, when I felt joy and peace, and when I felt furthest from that, and then kind of reflecting how I can respond to those experiences, good and bad inverted commas. Um, and one of the things that I kind of feel um, inspired to do now is perhaps just to begin to become more involved again with the Quaker community. But I have been involved with a group called the Kindlers, who are a recognised group within Quakers, and we travel around the country to meetings and provide the opportunity for friends to spend some time together and share with one another, get to know one another on a deeper level, really, and kind of really build that spiritual community. And that's kind of that having providing that space for people to go beyond the small talk over coffee after a meeting, but actually really know one another, really see one another, really listen to one another in the things that are eternal, to use the cliche. That's kind of what's important. And we also as Kindlers, we write, publish booklets, and many years ago, I wrote a booklet on answering that of God, and that for me is, and was at the time and continues to be now, a key part of my spiritual practice, trying to answer that of God in everyone.
Mm. Well, there's a lot in there that I want to ask more about, Peter. Can I can I start with you talked about belief at the beginning. I
Mm.
wonder if you can say a bit more about where you are now with belief, God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, Christianity in general.
Okay. So uh, for me, belief isn't just, or isn't even primarily a head thing. It's about trust and giving our heart to something. I think I mentioned Marcus Borg earlier. He was helpful in kind of setting out the different aspects of what belief is. Um, and it's about kind of trusting in God and in God's love. Um, I I don't know whether I would describe myself as a Christian or not. I would probably say, well, it depends what you mean by Christian. I don't subscribe to the creeds, the traditional, the Athanasian Creed, or uh, anything like that. But I think in the last couple of years, I've come to look with fresh eyes at the at some of the teachings, particularly the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament. Um, my more recent Kindlers booklet is kind of looking at Bible passages and reinterpreting them in a new light. Um, so I, for me, ultimately, um, we're all one. So it's similar to what I was going full circle to what I wrote in that essay, panentheism, I think you'd call it, that God is in all things and all things are in God. In God we live, in God we breathe, in God is our true essence and our being. And we have this spirit, this eternal self within all of us, and and without any exceptions. Think of the politician who pushes our buttons, or anyone. It's there, but it's hidden. We all of us. I mean, what my favorite parable in the New Testament is the parable of the prodigal son, who goes off away from his father, kind of demands his inheritance, and wanders off and wastes it all on selfish living in a faraway land. And then finally, after many years and in a time of kind of need, when he's starving, when he's having to kind of be a swineherd just to get some scraps to eat, um, at that point, there's the phrase, he comes to his senses, and he decides to kind of go back to his father's home, and says, well, I'll be a hired servant there, and I'll be better off. He doesn't expect sort of to be welcomed back with opened arms. That's too good to be true for him, where he is in that moment. Um, but in a sense, for me, we are all the prodigal child. We've all um, wandered from home. We've forgot who we are in our deepest, truest, eternal self, and we live selfishly. We live to serve our own needs, our own wants, and very often don't have regard for others, or for nature, or for the planet. And sooner or later, I believe that all of us will come to our senses and begin that kind of journey back home. But the parable also works on another level for me, because let's say in meeting for worship, how many times during the hour my mind wanders off somewhere, and then after a few seconds or a few minutes, I come to my senses, and I just observe that that's happened, and I make a conscious decision to be present. I think that's what I would say is my spiritual practice above all else at the moment. To Presence for me is another name for spirit, is another name for God. And to be present, fully present, means to let spirit or God live through me, so that there's no kind of difference, if you like. There's no boundary. Where does one end and the other begin? And 1,000 times a day, I forget, I wander off, and whenever I'm aware, I attempt to bring myself back. And Jesus, for me, is shows us what God is like. Jesus is, for me, the difference between Jesus and other human beings is not that he was God and we aren't, that there was some difference in nature, but that he was fully aware of who he was. I and my father are one. Um, Before Abraham was, I am. He was in touch with his deepest, truest self, and he lived from that place, and he loved from that place. And that's the litmus test of any teaching, any any book, any passage in the Bible. Um, is it is it loving? Is it kind? Because if it isn't coming from a place of love and kindness, and it is, even it's encouraging judgment or unforgiveness or um, anything, hatred of another group of people, anything like that, then it cannot have come from God. Doesn't matter if it's in the Bible, doesn't matter if it's spoken by the person I respect the most in all the world. If it's not loving, it's not true, and it's not from God.
Mm. So it's really interesting to me that you speak as powerfully as that and yet don't call yourself Christian. And I wonder if you've got any further thoughts on why that is. I mean, is it a sense of, I'm not good enough or something like that? Or that others' opinions and descriptions or definitions of Christianity is different from yours? Is it around that? Um, because one of the things I've read recently is Tom Holland, who's an historian, who makes the point that those of us who've been brought up in this culture within Britain are so Christian down to our marrow that we don't even realize it. And even when we're saying we're not Christian, I could imagine just like you have. He says this is so Christian. Our rejection of Christianity is in itself such a Christian thing to do. Um, what do you make of that? Because what he follows on by saying is then this kind of idea that we're all culturally Christian, and that the way we want to live a good life and to be kind and to be loving is in itself Christian. What do you make of that?
Yeah, there's probably a lot of truth in that. I kind of, when I hear a new idea, I need time to reflect on it. But yes, the sense of, um, I've always been wary of labels, um, because, for me, that we're not we're all one, and yet we're all unique in a way as well. And there can be as much variation within the label as there is. Um, I may be, closer to somebody in another faith at the core and at the essence than somebody within my own faith, in terms of the way of life, in terms of the focus on what the important things. Interestingly, the label Quaker is not one that I have difficulties with, because I feel that that term is, wide enough. It's a non-dogmatic term. It doesn't. Uh, yeah, I don't, for whatever reason, I'm more comfortable to say I'm a Quaker than to say, um, I'm a Christian, for example. The difficulty with words is that they can mean different things to different people, and they can be misunderstood. So if I said to somebody I'm a Christian, my sense would be that oftentimes they would be assuming, in that case, you believe X, Y, Z, um, and that wouldn't actually be so,
Mm.
or wouldn't, or I would believe those things not in a literal way, but maybe in an allegorical way.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, yeah. So you talked a bit about loving kindness and non-judgmentalism. I'm just wondering if you think sometimes around the idea that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, that phrase, and that sometimes we don't always know what the right thing to do is, or we think we're doing the right thing, and it turns out to have some unseen consequences which we regret, which we think, oh, that's perhaps not, in hindsight, that wasn't the right thing to do, and perhaps it wasn't the kind thing to do. And I suppose a few things occurred to me is, love was always the term that we were taught and we used. And nowadays we're talking about kindness. And I
Mm.
wonder why the word kindness has suddenly taken off instead of love. And still don't have any firm thoughts about that, about where that's come from. And in terms of judgmentalism, it occurs to me that sometimes some forms of being judgmental about certain types of behavior and boundaries is actually really important for us not to get swept away in some mushy kind of everything's fine when actually it's not, and there's a lot of pain and hurt in the world.
Yes, there's a huge amount. That's I mean, you began that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, I think. Now, for me, hell isn't a place we go to after death if we have believed the wrong things or behaved in unkind ways. It's a state that we create for ourselves and one another here now on this planet. There's a huge amount in what you've just said. Another thing that came to me is that Quaker phrase from the Advices and Queries, which I really like, and which is maybe lacking in some of the other denominations, is the consider it possible that you may be mistaken. Absolutely, we can think that we're doing the kind thing, the loving thing, um, and not be, which is why the examine, that looking back,
Mm.
is such a helpful tool because I can take that time to reflect and actually think, when was I not acting in a kind way? Um, I You talked about kindness rather than love. I called the book The Kindness of Presence rather than the love of presence, because again, love is a word like Christianity, which for me is often understood, is often kind of even cheapened or devalued because um, we use it too freely. We say, I love you, and what we may mean is I need you, or
Mm.
it's let us show that we love one another. Um, Let us be that love, live that love, and then we can use the words, and they'll have meaning. We can say I can say I love green tea or whatever, but it's
Yeah.
whereas kindness is maybe less open to interpretation, and even, I mean, even that, of course, can be misunderstood, and we can think we're being kind, and actually we're not, which is why presence comes before kindness. Um, of myself, if it's just me, small self, Peter Parr, acting in a certain way, I may think, oh, I'm being kind. Um, but I don't know how everything fits together in this huge tapestry that is the universe, where everything's interconnected, and I'm just a tiny part of that one whole, not apart from it, but a part of it, but a small part, tiny part. Um, but it's just to be, if I'm present, if I'm in touch with my deepest, truest self, then it's about being guided by the spirit of love. And again, this is something that really, I think, is so valuable within the Quaker tradition, is that idea of discernment, that even in our business meetings, when we make decisions, we are kind of, if if it's working well, it's spirit led, it's guided by love. And if the decision is not a loving one, then it actually wasn't spirit led. That's what I would say. So yeah, I fail 100 times a day, and we all will fall down.
Mm.
But it's again not about judging ourselves, just as it's not about judging others, because we are children of God and they're children of God's, and it's just, and we don't have to do this on our own. In fact, we can't do it on our own. We can't express love because unless it's love within us that's the source. So we have to be in touch with that. And when I'm in touch with that, then all my if I'm not in touch with that, I can be anxious, I can be fearful, I can get easily overwhelmed or stressed, irritable. Somebody cuts me up in traffic, I'm. But when I'm centered, when I'm in touch with my true self, I can experience what Christians might say, the peace which passes understanding, the peace which isn't from here, but it comes from from dwelling in the vine.
Mm.
And
Yes, and you see, one of the things that I observe is something of what you talked about there, the anxiety and the overwhelm and the despair. I witness and observe that amongst, it's not just Quakers, but this is who we're talking about. And I kind of I kind of see it as a description of where people are at spiritually if they're
mm,
caught up in a huge amount of despair about the world, politics, um, policy changes, um, the climate change and the responses to it. And I see a lot of Quaker energy and time being caught up in this. And the way that I see it is, you look around a meeting and there's a lot of furrowed brows and tense kind of postures, and for me that's a sign that people are getting caught up in really looking in the wrong direction, if you see what I mean.
mm.
What do you make of the current levels of despair and worry amongst Quaker meetings?
well, it's something that I know I experience within myself as well. Um, when I'm not centered, when I'm relying on or attempting to rely on my own strength and my own intellect and my own answers and my own understanding, um, when I'm not kind of, I don't know if dependent is the right word, but when I'm not
Mm.
falling back, stepping back and letting spirit lead the way, of course we will experience despair. There is so much outwardly that can be a cause of despair. Big things or things very much closer to home. I notice quite often in myself, I may be sitting down to have my porridge for breakfast, and there's some negativity that I'm conscious of in my mind, and I'm thinking of a particular world leader, for example, or and there's that angst within me, and there's that, well, the despair that people would actually vote for that to the extent that they have, that somebody with those views would actually win. But that's because I'm not in those moments when I'm having those thoughts. I've wondered. I've gone off to that faraway land, like the prodigal son. I am living from my own energy, my small self. Ego is a word we hear a lot, um, and and so if I see other people in the Quaker meeting or elsewhere, yes, there will be the source of hope, and so if we're not rooted in that, we are cutting ourselves off from that hope, and the world can appear a desperate place. But then the other thing I would say, even on a more kind of practical level, if we switch on the news is only reporting or overwhelmingly reporting the negative things. What about all the wonderful, amazing things that are going on in the world as well? Now, if we, as you say, turn the other way and look in that direction, and we see all those acts of maybe, very small, simple acts of kindness given, received, then yeah, even in the worst situation, hope can be found. I mean, I'm not there, but um, we hear accounts of people in like Viktor Frankl or whatever in concentration camps who were able to have that hope,
Mm.
and it's there if we are open to seeing it, and if that's what we want to look for and focus on.
Mm. Yes, and the other thing, listening to you, I was thinking about this, the difference between being in a Quaker community or meeting, or perhaps in a living in a middle class suburb, or living in a context where there isn't much crime, or working in a professional, like a library or something, and everything's very quiet and calm and safe, and how your spiritual life can be quite straightforward in those
Yes.
circumstances. And if you dare to move out beyond that and to go into places which are hard, and tough, and there's deprivation and there's poverty and there's hardship. This is where this is where I feel we really have to look at what our ways of being are, because this is where the judgmentalism, I think, there's something in it for me, which is we have to really think about, because when we keep ourselves in fairly safe, cloistered environments, we don't have to be judgmental so much, because somebody's
Mm,
taken all the cake or whatever. Um, Whereas when you go into, places where there's drug abuse and child abuse and domestic abuse and violence against women, whatever it might be, there is a judgmentalism and a stopping of things and a no and saying no and being the no, which is about asserting boundaries. And there's actually that is a loving kindness. And the
yes.
refusing to say no and stepping back from that, almost not getting your hands dirty, is not
Mm,
kind.
mm,
I think sometimes that we can be a little bit too cloistered, perhaps. Or, well, in some senses, not cloistered enough for a deep spiritual life. And then other times, not going out into these dark places and having to make some really tough calls sometimes. Being where there
yes.
is real despair rather than what we are thinking of as despair, which is actually something that's happening on the other side of the world compared to something that's happening just down the road from where you live.
Yeah. Yes. It's I had a small illustration of that in my own life. For many, well, for all of my adult life, pretty much, I've lived on my own. And it's very easy to be centered and rooted when I'm sat in my meditation chair, and I can structure the daily routine purely around myself. And then, yes, when I can go out into the world occasionally and remain present because I have that kind of groundedness. But I had the experience this last year that for the first time in my adult life, I've been living with someone else. And that has been an incredibly useful, transformative, enriching experience. But it's taken me to the limits of and sometimes beyond the edge of my comfort zone, and it's thrown up a lot of things which shows that actually there is the judgmentalism, there is the it's much harder to be centered when you're having to kind of, for me, when I'm having to make adjustments to my routine, and then how much more, and that's just a very small scale example of sharing a living space with somebody. But in what you're describing about moving, living in another part of the world, and where there's a lot of suffering, a lot of crime, a lot of stuff that maybe many of us within the Quaker community are quite far removed from, and actually experiencing that firsthand, then yeah, that's a real different kettle of fish, and I have enormous respect and admiration for those who can take um, that stillness, that inner stillness, that peace and that calm into those situations and be love. And being love doesn't mean saying yes to the oppressor, the abuser, or the bully or any of uh, those things, but it's so definitely we need the boundaries. We need to say this behavior is not acceptable, and we need to protect those who are facing that different kinds of oppression. But at the same time, it's a dichotomy. Not lose sight of the fact that even in the oppressor, even in the murderer, there is still, I think George Fox used the word transgressed. There is that of God within them that they are transgressing, that they're denying, that they're not aware of. But it's still there, and therefore there's still the hope, there's still the potential, even in so, which is why I could never support the death penalty, for example, because there is always that chance of repentance and of coming to our senses. But the way that a person who is and whether it's myself or whether it's somebody that I'm interacting with on a daily level or whether it's a world leader, I strongly have a sense that if we meet that energy in them with a similar kind of counter energy, if we attack the attacker if in thoughts or words, they're just going to build their wall even more, and they're going to counter attack in defense. Whereas if we can, yes, be very clear that the behavior is not something we condone and the behavior needs to stop, and we need to do the practical things, the outward things, to bring about change and to protect those who need it, but still have within us that do it in a way that is not making a devil of the person. They're still a child of God, even though they're behaving in abhorrent, completely unacceptable ways. I know that if I'm behaving in a less than kind way, or a less, let's say, an unconscious way, because it's when I behave in an unconscious way, it's not a, it's exactly that. It's I'm reacting. I'm not responding in the moment. I'm what I say or what I do or how I act is based on past conditioning, maybe traumatic events from many years ago that are kind of unconsciously influencing my behavior in the moment. So if I snap at somebody, then what's going to help me to change is not somebody snapping back at me or saying you shouldn't do that, that's wrong. Well, maybe that is necessary, but it's how you phrase that. I'll sort of caveat what I said. So it's the spirit of how we respond. Are we responding to the unkindness, to the cruelty, or are we reacting unconsciously to it? And I feel that if we can respond, I'm not saying we will bring about change, but we certainly won't bring about change if we react.
Mm. So I'm just thinking about you mentioned about solitude. Um, and there was a time, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, when I lived on my own for a good 3 or 4 years. And it really resonated with me what you said about, it's it's so much more straightforward living on your own when none of your stuff ever gets moved. Where you left things is where they are. And the only mess that's there is because you made it, and it's everything's straightforward and everything's silent until you turn the radio on. Everything's still, everything's quiet, everything's ordered. Um, and how that is deeply enriching. And certainly for some part of your life, I mean, I would recommend it for anyone. Um, But then there's a different kind of benefit you get from community. And you talked very early on about this need for community. I wonder
Mm.
if you can say a bit more about that. What is it that's the right balance for you between solitude and community? And what is it that makes you want more solitude or want you make more community? What is that? What do you get from it and what makes you seek it out?
Well, I feel that the balance is different. I'm reminded of that Taoist symbol, the yin and the yang, that we do need balance when we're craving the solitude and the stillness. We still need not completely to isolate us from community, and when we're very active and engaged in the world, we still need that balance of contemplation. But as to what the right balance will be, it will vary from person to person, and it will definitely also vary. It has varied at different stages and times in our lives. And what will be the right balance at one point will be different at another. I'm sensing now, as I say, that after a long period of where I've been very much towards the cloistered end of the spectrum, where my practice now, where I'm feeling called now, is to be present and be kind in the world. So and we can make that a practice of anything, even if it's going into the office for work. Um, I've in the past fallen into the trap of the Quaker spirituality is meant to encompass all of life, and yet I've kind of compartmentalized my life. I've had my working life, I've had my life as a kindler, as a writer, as a partner, whatever it might be, as a son, as all the different sort of roles. And But it's about being faithful, being true in all those situations, being present in all of those situations, um, and and definitely what the world needs, I think, is if we can bring that presence, um, that uh, that groundedness, that rootedness into our day-to-day relationships with the people that we interact with in the normal course of our lives, and also into those, if we happen to be in those roles, if we're a teacher, to bring it into the classroom. If we're a politician, and I know we've got what, 5 Quaker MPs now in the Commons, to bring that groundedness, that stillness into the cauldron that is Prime Minister's Question Time. Imagine how different it would be if people were centered and grounded in those places. But that's not my path. I'm not an MP, but I do go into work and I can make a conscious choice how to be in my interactions with colleagues. Do I say, oh, this doesn't matter? I just want to get through the day as quickly as possible and then get home and then I can meditate and then I can write and then I can, yeah. Or do I live it in the moment? And I'm feeling now that I've done a lot of the theory and it is time to practice more in the marketplace, as Buddhists might say, in the hustle and bustle.
That sounds very exciting, new departure for you then, because this is where you'll put to test all of your meditations and contemplations. What are you, what how are you preparing yourself for this new task, this new path? I mean, are there things that you're consciously trying to do to structure that for yourself? Do you arrive at lunchtime in a crumpled mess thinking, oh my gosh, that's 67 times I've not lived up to my own expectations? Or,
No.
I mean, how are you managing it?
Well, I don't beat myself up when I fall down. I observe, and yeah, regret doesn't help anyone. It's about making the choice anew in each new moment. So mindfulness is key for me. That being present. What can I do to help myself be present? Well, I've on my phone, I found an app. It's the Plum Village app, which is Thich Nhat Hanh's Buddhist community, and they have like a meditation bell or gong, which sounds every quarter of an hour. So I get a little notification on my phone, and it just recalls me back to the present moment. And I take a practice that I like. I park my car um, on the edge of the town centre. So the last 10 minutes into the office, I walk, and that's an opportunity to just be present in the moment and focus as I'm walking in. Um, it's for each of us there will be different tools that will help us. And I've used different tools at different times. Definitely quiet time, morning and evening can help. So I'm not going completely the other way. I'm keeping that kind of time to recenter myself. Definitely, I find um, it's not a selfish thing to set aside time for contemplation and stillness because I know that I can show up more. I can be fully present when I allow myself that time and space. So my going out into the world, into the marketplace, for another person, people would look at my where I'm sort of looking to be, and they'd say, "Well, you're still a hermit," or because it's just I'm just moving. I'm moving at a pace that feels right. I'm moving at a pace that feels that I'm responding to what love requires. I'm attending to what love requires, which we know how that advice ends. May or may not be great busyness.
Mm.
For me, it's perhaps being a little busier than I have been, but not still not overdoing it, not outrunning my guide, not
Mm.
doing more than I can handle and then burning myself out. And so, yeah, just being attentive to what feels right.
Yeah, I mean, all of those things sound really helpful because I know. I know when I was in my 30s, and I've spoken to some other people in their 30s recently, is that when you're caught up in that work routines and how to try to live a spiritual life, follow a spiritual path amidst all of that pressure
Mm.
and, turmoil is very difficult. And there's perhaps some guidance from those of us who are a little bit older to give some practical clues, really. Um, so you've mentioned some practical things at the start of the day and as you walk into work. Is there anything you do as you face difficult situations or difficult people in a work context? Do you have any practices?
Um, it's a question of, do I remember in those moments? Because if I'm if I'm not if I've wondered and something happens at work, I will react. I won't respond consciously. But if I can kind of catch myself, if I can notice that beginnings of a judgmental thought and observe it, and kind of when I'm observing it, I'm putting a space between the thought and the the choice maker, the decision taker in myself, and I'm choosing not to identify with that thought. So if I can just be aware, I mean, practices, practical things. If somebody sends me an email at work, which is um, which pushes my buttons, which I interpret the small self in me interprets as an attack. The best thing I can do is press the pause button and give myself time to come to my senses. Because if I type a quick, pithy, cutting response back, I'm going to regret it later. It's not going to help anyone. It's not going to help that work relationship. Um, so if I can't respond with love, with kindness, with presence, then it's better not to respond at all in that moment, but to wait until such a time that I can give a considered response. So yeah, I would say having pause, having space, and I guess, and I'm really thinking about my own situation and advising myself now, because I know that tomorrow I'm going to go into the office and I can imagine situations that might arise. Okay, what can I do? Well, I can get up out of my chair every so often and just go to the tea point and be conscious as I'm washing my hands or pouring the cup of tea. Anything to bring me back to the present moment and bring me back to my senses, so that when I get back to this computer screen and there's that email from the boss's boss or whatever it might be, asking me to do something yesterday, then I can I can take that. I'm not going to be knocked off balance by it. I'll be able to respond consciously and with presence, because I've I've got that presence. The presence is with me, and the presence is always with me. God is everywhere. But am I allowing it? Am I letting it be? So am I open to it? So yeah, I find if I'm the longer I sit it facing a screen, I get more and more caught up in it.
Mm.
So take a step back, um, go and stretch my legs, go for a walk at lunchtime, breathe the fresh air. Yeah, don't spend the lunch hour on
Yeah.
the internet just looking at more bad news or
Yeah.
football results when my team's lost, or anything that might um, knock me off course. But be yeah, take that pause, take that time out.
Yeah, I mean that's all great advice. One of the things as you were speaking that I was thinking of, I was really feeling for people in very, very stressful jobs, which are very people present, like like customer facing roles where they can't do any of that. They can't walk away because that's not an email, that's a customer in their face like this, taking it all out on them. And it's usually the lowest paid people in the frontline roles.
Yes.
And it reminds me of what I was saying earlier about those people living in communities with high crime and drugs and all sorts. And
Mm.
how, given the circumstance that they're operating in and the resources they have and perhaps the trauma they've experienced and their lack of good food or whatever, compared to me. So I can walk into a situation all calm and well fed and warm, um, and I've had enough therapy to sort out all of my immediate traumatic responses. And I think, fair play to them, they actually deal with these situations at a far higher intensity than I have to deal with. And even if I think, oh, that was a bit snappy, actually, they have just dealt with that situation extraordinarily well.
Mm.
And it reminds me of that kind of that Bible story of the very poor woman who goes to church and gives a tiny coin, but actually that coin is like an enormous amount of her wealth or her income,
Yeah.
compared to the rich man who puts in a pot of gold, which is almost nothing for him. And I just wonder sometimes whether Quakers can tend to be a little bit smug about, aren't I the peaceful person? Um, but we're just not out there enough, you
Mm.
know? So that's me being judgmental, and I recognize that. And it's I do offer it in kindness in the sense of I I I I wish for people to be out there in the world, as people seeking to live spiritual lives. I think until you're out there in the world, I think the cloistered part is important, and I love your experience of that and the way you've expressed it, because I wish that for people too. I think it's so valuable. But it's almost like we need both spaces,
Mm.
you know?
No, you make really important points, Emma, and maybe, as you say, the responsibility on those of us who have had the time and the opportunity to um, kind of go within and do the inner work and do the shadow work and have the therapy and work through our issues is so much greater that really um, we and I don't believe that we're going to be judged by an external God at some point in terms of what we did or what we didn't do. But I feel when we look back at the end of our lives, um, with maybe we will have an awareness of maybe the end of our lives there will be a kind of self-examine, and we'll look back and we'll think, actually I had all these opportunities, I had all these gifts, I had all this capacity and time, and what did I do with it?
Answered lots of emails.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel that Quakers do enough of this kind of teaching and advice and guidance because I think we all need it. We certainly need it in the early part of our lives, in our 20s, 30s, 40s. Um, but we go on needing it as well. Do you feel like we do enough?
Um, when it comes to advice, I mean, I last summer I completed a 3 year training course to be a spiritual accompanier.
Mm.
And spiritual accompaniment, sometimes it's called spiritual direction, but I shy away from that word because it's another director. Again, it's one of those words where it's open to misinterpretation. It's the spirit who is the guide, the director. Um, the accompanyer's role is to journey alongside somebody else, and I feel, I mean, that has it's much more well known in other Christian denominations than in Quaker circles. But it's the idea of companionship, a soul friend, an anam cara, someone to walk alongside us in our journey. And I feel there's definitely a place for that in Quakers, and um, that it would be nice to have those opportunities. And I mean, I'll talk about Kindlers in a second, but um, it's I'm a little wary of the word advice because it's accompaniment is more about helping somebody to find within themselves the answers to their own questions that are right for them.
Mhm.
So if we're talking about, for example, somebody comes and seeks advice, should I do more, go out into the world more and do more? Well, that's not for me to say or anyone else to say. It's for them to listen to those promptings of love and truth in their hearts at that particular juncture in their lives.
Mm.
What is love asking of them now, and help them to kind of get in touch with that, and maybe introduce them to some practices, offer them a range, what can help you reach within to get in touch with the answers to their own questions. Um, Quakers are kind of the closest thing maybe that we have to like traveling ministers of old
Mm.
in Quakers in the UK. But again, for me, with the Quakers, if I'm going to facilitate a day at a meeting, for me, the theme that we explore and any input that we may give as facilitators is secondary to that space for people within the meeting to connect with and listen to and share with one another and learn from one another. But we only learn from one another if we know one another, if we share those experiences, and often we don't do that. So the Kindler's Day is the opportunity
Mm.
where there's no business that needs to be attended to. There's none of the kind of the usual things that get in the way. It's dedicated time to focus on just having those conversations and listening with one another and being present with one another, and and deepening, nourishing that spiritual community. I think in an ideal world, there'd be no need for kindlers because that that would be every meeting would have that kind of
Mm.
within themselves, that they would have that time and that space for those conversations, and they wouldn't need to have a kindlers day once a year.
Well, I mean, it's really interesting that you've described Kindlers as the closest thing we have to traveling ministers because I hadn't thought of it like that before. And I think it's a fair point. And I suppose I didn't realize how much that was still being done. Um, I think there's a real place for kindlers and spiritual accompaniment. And I suppose one of the things that I'm aware of is that individual meetings, um, I'm not sure they're able to do it, individual meetings. I think there's some aspect of traveling which is important, and that you will be far better received in my meeting than in your own, I suspect, because we welcome, there's a wisdom that the stranger comes with. You're not caught up in the politics, you're not caught up in the tea rota or whatever.
Mm.
So I'm really intrigued that you've described the Kindlers as that. Because one of the things that if we switch into thinking about the future of Quakers and how do we try to, strengthen our community, I think spiritual accompaniment is one important thing that I think we should be doing more of. And I'd be interested to know more about that, whether it was within Quakers that you did that or outside.
Mm.
And also, I think this idea of traveling ministers is the other thing we can do. So again, I'm interested to link that with Kindlers. Do you think those two are key parts of what we could do in the future?
Um, yes, I think they would both be very valuable things. The course I did in spiritual accompaniment was ecumenical Christian course, not Quaker, although one of the tutors uh, is a Quaker, and I think that um, would be valuable, but yes, how might that be offered? I'm aware that there is a program at Woodbrook,
Mm.
which is working around spiritual accompaniment specifically for friends who are engaged in activism, and to kind of help them discern how far to go with that activism in terms of maybe putting themselves in situations where they may risk arrest and that kind of thing, which is quite specific. But as far as I know, it's very much in its infancy, and there's not a huge amount. I mean, if if I hadn't trained as a spiritual accompanier and I was looking for something like that, where would I go within the Quaker community? Who would I talk to? There's no.
No.
If I were in a Christian denomination, I could reach out to my local diocese and they'd give me a directory of all the trained spiritual accompaniers, and I'd be able to reach out to them. That, so far as I'm aware, that doesn't exist within Friends.
No. So, so let's talk about the future of Quakers then. What are your fears about the future or your hopes for the future? Because these videos came from the conference that I attended in October around the futures of Quakers, and we were, there's 10,000 of us, which is fewer than there were decades ago. So, what are your hopes or fears for the future?
Well, Quakers for me, and the the Quaker way in unprogrammed meetings, we have tremendous gifts, I think, to share with and offer to the world, and those gifts won't necessarily be ones that will resonate with everyone. They won't resonate with everyone, but there's definitely a place. There's definitely um, people for whom, just like I was 20 years ago when I went onto that BBC website, and all the things that Quakers stood for resonated, and that just met my need. Um, and so there is a need, and we've got so much to offer. So I do hope that we will continue to be available to people, and all the it's what I the best thing for me about Quakers is that it's a living tradition. It's not ossified. It's not set in stone. We are open to that inspiration in the moment. We're guided by that inspiration in the moment. And if I think if we continue to be guided, if we continue to be responsive, then as long as there is a purpose for us here, we will continue to be here because we'll be responding to spirit and spirit will see to it. But if we lose touch with the spirit and we kind of do things because we've always done them a certain way and we're not alive to that living promptings of love and truth in each of our hearts in the moment, if we're not the patterns and the examples that George Fox wrote about, then Quakers may die at some point. But actually, if we're not in touch with spirit, then will that be a loss?
Yeah.
Because the spirit will never die. Spirit will always be speaking to those who would listen.
Mm.
And whether that's through the medium of Quakers or through the medium of any of these emerging spiritualities and teachers that we see on YouTube, or whether that's through traditional religions or any number of ways, spirit will find a way. And I'm absolutely, consider it possible you may be mistaken, but if there's one thing I'm certain of is that spirit will find a way, love will find a way. And if we are open, then that can be through us, that can be through Quakers, but that's up to us.
Mm. Well, that's great. That's very thought provoking, but also positive for the future, I think. So, would you say that on the whole, you're hopeful?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, definitely.
Well, thank you very much for talking to me today, Peter. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Emma. I've enjoyed it.